Today I'm going to start with one of the arguments that converted me to Christianity. If any of you have heard my testimony or understand what my faith journey was like, I came from being a very skeptical atheist to then coming back to the faith I was born into, which was Judaism. But then from there, eventually I became a Christian. And I'm going to talk a lot about one of the arguments that really convinced me to become a Christian in the first place. I think what you'll see, though, is that a lot of these arguments, they work in one context and they work in other contexts. The example that I'll give, and I think I'm trying to do something similar here, is when the apostles go to Berea in Acts 17, 10, 12. Let me just read this. And he says, and the author says, "As soon as night had fallen, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now the Bereans were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if these teachings were true. As a result, many of them believed, along with quite a few prominent Greek women and men." So the question is, what's going on here? That's becoming a witness to these people to follow the gospel and accept Jesus Christ. What's happening is Paul and Silas start preaching. And then the Jews, who are clearly noble-minded, some people say it just makes them like kind of aristocratic, they're literate, all this kind of stuff. So who knows how to interpret the phrase noble-minded? But basically, they start looking in the Old Testament, which is what they have in front of them, and they start to say, is what this guy's saying, does it line up with history? We've got all these prophecies. Did they come true? Right? How would we know if this current new revelation has any basis in reality? If this guy's the Messiah, he's probably going to fulfill the messianic prophecies that are in the Old Testament. And so that's one aspect of the argument from history, or as we'll see, the argument from prophecy even. But once the Jews, who are like, oh my goodness, this guy did fulfill all these prophecies. Greeks, who have no reason to be particularly invested in this fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, also become Christians. Now, why might that be? Now, is it just the general evangelical witness of the idea of prophecy? Or is it this kind of broader, wow, but who can, no one in history has accurately predicted the future. Think about how much money, especially the ancient Greeks and other ancients, spent on oracles who could prophesy the future and tell cryptic tales about the future, because of how valuable it is to be able to accurately predict the future. If something can predict the future, right, especially in an ancient sense, it has this mythic, sacred, divine quality. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, about how the Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled in the New Testament, and how even the New Testament prophecies are fulfilled today. So the specific line from the Old Testament that really shook me to my core, and there are lots of others in Isaiah actually, that made me as a Jew start to look into the claims of Christianity. What Isaiah says here, and throughout all of Isaiah, just to give context, is he's rebuking Israel and then describing what needs to happen to Israel. So the beginning of Isaiah is a lot about how the Israelites have broken their covenant and how they're going to be punished. We know this in the future is Babylon. And now you can say this was the first prophecy in Isaiah that comes true, which shows credence to it. But a cynical, critical historian can look at these stuff and say, well, maybe it was written after all this stuff happened to explain how it happened. So there's no real prophetic weight to a total skeptic in those earlier prophecies in Isaiah. However, the prophecies about the Messiah are very interesting because Jews accept them, and we know for sure that Isaiah was written before Jesus actually arrived and came to be. I have another video actually on my channel, a very small video, about how the New Testament maybe predicts the temple. There are all these prophecies that came true that we kind of know were written before those events. And so how can we explain them? I'm just going to go into Isaiah 53 right now because I think not a lot of people realize the detail that goes on here. And then I'm going to go on into a little bit of how Jews explain these things and the conversation between Jews and then the Messianic Jews and Christians, how they interpret these passages and what makes the most sense. All right. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender root, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. And he was led, like a lamb, to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes life an offering for sin, we will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. And Isaiah is full of these, by the way. And you can go line by line and pick out the parts of Jesus' story that this is referring to. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, right? So there's this idea of the judgment and oppression. So the judgment that Pontius Pilate puts down. Yet who of his generation protested? This talks about how his disciples betray him. Not just Judas, but Peter denies him 3 times, right? So nobody's trying to help him, right? And he was assigned a grave with the wicked. He was killed in a way that was for humiliation, crucifixion, all these things. And you can go through them more, right? All the punishment. He heals wounds. He has wounds. He bears the sins of other people. And you might say, well, how do Jews explain this? That was my first reaction, by the way. I was Jewish, and I didn't really have the rabbinic tradition in the back of my mind. And I read this, and I'm like, this. I mean, I don't know that much about Jesus, but this is about Jesus, right? And what I'll explain what the Jews say, and then I'll explain why I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. But Jews basically argue that all of this conversation is actually about Israel in the broad sense, not about Jesus in the specific sense. But the reason I just don't think that's a very valid excuse. First of all, it could be both, right? Just because it is representative of Israel doesn't mean it could be representative of Jesus. But I don't even think it is representative of Israel. But first off, Isaiah says that his people are being saved by this group of people. For the transgression of my people, he was punished. He is singular. And then who is my people referring to? For the transgression of Israel, Israel is punished? Doesn't really make very much sense. And Isaiah just spent the entire previous half of the book talking about how Israel is horrible and deserves punishment. Right? And so Israel deserves punishment, so Israel get punished. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Doesn't really seem like we need to write a whole book about this. Regardless, you can imagine the Bereans, for instance, going back to these passages, hearing Paul preach, right? I think the interesting part is that the 12 apostles and Paul get physical visions of Jesus that convert them. So it's kind of hard to deny those things. But then there's all these other people in Acts who are kind of tacitly mentioned, all these other things, who don't actually get the beatific vision before they convert. And they're, in some way, more noble. The Bereans, of course, are referenced as being very noble. Right? And you can see how the physical image of Christ keeps his apostles sustained even into the later apostolic age. Right? Peter, in 2 Peter, loves referencing the fact that he knew Jesus. He just has this great relationship. I'm always moved, by the way, when I read Peter's epistles, because he just has this sense of I knew this guy and he was my best friend. And it's it's like I can't imagine, right? That the life that Peter lived, and just thinking about what his life and career and testimony would have been like, just to, it just bleeds through the epistles. It's great. Anyway, to get back to my main point about the argument from history, this vivid description of the exact events of Jesus' life occurs hundreds of years indisputably before Jesus arrives. In some sense, there has to be some, like, wow, look at this. And, even when I was skeptical before I was Christian, I was kind of like, well, maybe the cool part about Jesus, even if he was just a regular guy, is he did just coincidentally, through the accidents of history, happen to fulfill a bunch of prophecies, and then a bunch of people made a religion around him because of this convenient coincidence of history. So that seemed possible to me as an option at one point. But what I think has to even more impress us even more is what follows after Jesus. And to understand the impact Jesus had on history and the fulfillment of New Testament prophecy, we have to kind of explain what antiquity is like in broad strokes before Jesus arrives. So what I think people don't understand today and appreciate is that before Jesus, and especially before the law, the world did not care about morality in the way that we do today. And there were moral systems, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but most of the world was focused on brutal conquest and the adoration of deities so that they didn't punish you. Most gods are arbitrary, was kind of the understanding. They had personalities. They had interpersonal disputes. Nature was arbitrary. There was, in some sense, this idea that we should be conquering nature, society, other people, or giving up into nature, right? A lot of other ways of thinking are kind of like submitting to hierarchy in Hinduism, or in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's just accepting your own mortality, right? These lessons are kind of from an individual's perspective. And the world is full of just accepted brutality. I always think about Julius Caesar writing about his conquest of Gaul. A lot of people today read it and are like shocked by the way that he basically brags about committing a genocide on millions of innocent people, or not innocent, warriors, barbarians in his mind, who are just lesser and deserve genocide. And that he is showing his allegiance to Rome, his loyalty, his honor, his military prowess, and those are the things he's proud of. Not his moral accomplishments, but his physical prowess, his ability to dominate nature. I always think about Julius Caesar in his later life. He's about middle age before all of the stuff that happens that we know about Julius Caesar that we're always impressed by happens pretty late in his life. So when he's in his 30s and he passes, in one of his campaigns or in his military role, he passes a statue of Alexander the Great, who he admires, obviously, and so did everyone at his time, because Alexander the Great did what? What was the admirable thing Alexander the Great did? He conquered a bunch of people and was a good military warrior. And so Caesar's like, if only I wasn't such a failure. I will never live up to his, like, at my age, Alexander the Great had already died at the height of his conquest, and I'm just some random military guy. And so you can tell, and then this story, by the way, that Romans told each other about Julius Caesar, the irony is, of course, that Julius Caesar will become more powerful, prominent, and victorious than Alexander the Great in some sense, and that the Roman Empire embodies this ancient ethic of domination, and that's where honor, value, and glory all come from, is from this triumph of your will over the wills of other people. And that's just the manifest value system in this world. And it's not, and no one expects it to be different. There's no one in this society arguing that slavery is bad, for instance. There's no one in this, and in fact, they're probably bragging about how many slaves that they conquered. And that shows their natural superiority of their group. That's something they can rejoice in, right? They rejoice in the obvious superiority of their own group over other people, other people groups. Similar legal codes in the ancient world are usually just about ensuring peace and economic stability, like Hammurabi's code. Most of the ancient tablets we have to this day, from the Middle East especially, and from everywhere, including China, India. Don't think this is just localized to the European experience. This is universal. The Incans, right? Most of the stuff that we still have are just kings bragging about conquering other people. That's most of the historical record that we preserve in writing about human societies forever. When people are getting buried in almost every single society, they're getting buried with weapons, especially if they're men, because they're showing off, look, I was a powerful warrior. I dominated other people. That is the entire moral system before the law. We'll get into that in a second. And now, of course, there are philosophers, there are thinkers who talk about things like virtue. Confucius is a great example in the East. Buddha is another good example. And they talk about these things, but and Greek philosophy, I think, is a good example. Because what they're looking at is they're looking at a world that doesn't really care about morality. And Plato, for instance, in my opinion, is kind of just fantasizing in Plato's Republic about what if philosophers ran the world? What if people cared about morality and government? What if these questions that we ponder, what if they mattered to anybody? And for the hundreds of years afterwards, they just don't matter to anybody. Nobody's trying to create Plato's Republic in real life. Even though he makes all these points, he makes a very strong argument for why his system of government would be good and for everyone involved. Confucius has a little bit of staying power, probably because he's appealing. His argument most of the time is there's like the powerful person and the weak person, and the weak person should respect the powerful person, and the powerful person should protect the weak person. And there's some political convenience to that kind of an ideology, which gets adopted in the Eastern Asian cultures. But there's nothing really revolutionary about these ideas. People talk about them, but they're not going to change the face of the world. And there's no new moral order ushered in by this kind of philosophizing. It's just kind of out there. People are playing with ideas, right? Most of what amounts to moralizing in these societies can be boiled down to one person is saying, I am the most honorable. I follow traditions. I keep my word, right? All of these things. I'm reverential to the gods, that they don't destroy our society. These kinds of moral ethics. And then on the other side, there's an appeal to numbers, populism. I'll take two examples from the Roman history to kind of illustrate this point. On the left, this is a painting of Cato. Cato the Younger is epitomized as being a moralist and as someone who was constantly complaining about the decadence and the destruction of morality in Rome at the time of Caesar. And he infamously wore a black toga instead of a white toga because it was more old-fashioned and didn't represent the decadence of the more newer types of clothing. He was against Greek because Greek was kind of like this decadent culture and society as opposed to the austere Roman society. And eventually when he's defeated in the Civil War by Caesar, he, of course, can't live with the shame of loss, of losing, of being a loser, that he kills himself. And in a horribly gruesome way, and I won't go into it, but he basically is bound by honor to kill himself after he's dishonored himself, his cause, his family, all of these things. He has to kill himself. And honor killings are actually pretty common across cultures throughout the world. In the New World, North and South America before Christianity, in the Middle East, in Rome, Greece, Norse, Japan is an infamous example of honor killing that basically continued until the modern day. There's lots of Muslim countries where honor killing is still common, and where in fact some people are obligated to kill their own children because of honor. It's brutal. It's something that we don't even recognize today as being a part of a moral sphere. And then on the other hand, there's this kind of populist appeal to morality. In the Roman context, there's this appeal to numbers, citizens. The real people of Rome should be being treated well by their government, surely because of their numbers. They're the majority. They're the plebeians, right? The plebeian classes attracted to this kind of ethic of, well, there's more of us than there are of patricians, so we should get free things, kind of, is a lot of the way that it goes. And they are very swept up by emotions and just this kind of math, right? This material thing, like, okay, if we have to distribute X good and there's 6 of us and 1 of you, we should get it because there's 6 of us and you shouldn't. This kind of mathematical egalitarianism that humans, I think, we always have this kind of instinct of what's fair, right? Let's do some like material numbers gaming. And this is kind of infamous in lots of societies, especially the Republican Roman, Greek, Greco-Roman societies, where they kind of are trying to abate this because they feel like it has this negative long-term effect. Because if you kind of give in to populism, it just creates more populism, emotionalism. Eventually Caesar uses this populism to rise and destroy the Republican system to replace it with an empire. So it's kind of unstable, and that's why the traditionalists in these societies usually oppose populism. But this is basically the core of moral argument prior to Christianity: is should we be traditional? Should we be honorable? Should we be austere? Should we be, great in some serious way? Some Alexander the Great is the pinnacle of this. Julius Caesar is the pinnacle of this kind of domination of other people, and this kind of stoicism versus, on the other hand, a more egalitarian, materialistic way of thinking. This is contrasted, I think, by the law of the Old Testament. And what's so interesting about it is that there's basically two main elements of the law that's delivered by God to the Jews in the Old Testament, right? There's the moral problem addressing thing, right? So that whole conversation we're having about what's good before, it basically boils down to caring for vulnerable people and protecting them from harm and oppression, right? There's a motif in the Old Testament of, you guys need to take care of widows and orphans. You need to make sure that there's some part of your land that for vagrants, people that walk through that need food, homeless people, you should be treating them well. And you can kind of confuse this, I think, with the populist appeal of the previous societies that tends to happen. The kind of Spartacist, kind of Athenian revolt type societies where they're trying to redistribute wealth, but the law doesn't actually say that people should have wealth. In fact, it looks very negatively on receiving gifts and wealth and stuff. What it really seems to be focusing on is making sure that vulnerable people are protected, more so than just giving people free money, which I think a lot of people don't really understand today when they look back on this, because I think a lot of people want to redefine this kind of Old Testament focus on charity, which is important in kind of more modern context, but we'll get into that later. And then there's the secondary goal of a lot of the law, which is to separate this group of people who are beginning this moral experiment in the world, to separate them from all of the stuff I was just talking about before, right? People will always emphasize the brutality of the conquest of Canaan and the rigid separation laws about not accepting other gods and doing all this other stuff. But if you look at the religions, people used to think, by the way, before critical scholarship, used to think obviously the Israelites are biased and they're exaggerating all of the horrible stuff that the societies around them in Canaan were doing. But now we've got archaeological evidence and we've got anthropological evidence that there probably was some messed up stuff, and there are societies, and we rediscovered them, or I say we rediscovered them, but there were human societies that were doing child sacrifice, that were sacrificing humans up until the 15th century, and doing horrible, brutal stuff that God needed to make sure, that the Old Testament law was trying to make sure they were separated from, so that they could actually pursue and focus on pursuing this moral project, separated from that paradigm we were talking about earlier, okay, in general, and also very specific, obviously horrible practices. And so the unique thing about Jesus is, remember that I was saying earlier about charity, and that what charity is doing, the principle in the Old Testament, is what it's saying is there are powerful people, wealthy people, who aren't necessarily inherently bad. I think the Old Testament has this kind of, Abraham, Jacob, they're very successful people, and they're righteous people. Lot is successful. Job is successful physically and prosperous in a physical sense. But what they need to do with that, the reason we have power and all these things, is to take care of vulnerable people. And so what the person of Jesus is and does is he combines the sufferer, the vulnerable focus of our moral effort, right? Because we're kind of answering this moral question, that dilemma earlier. Well, what's the point of morality? Is it tradition? Is it about honor? Is it about making sure that most people are fed fairly or equitably? But then the answer that the Bible gives and that God gives through the Bible is that the vulnerable must be taken care of. And so what Jesus does is he's the king, but he shows that he combines those motifs of the powerful person with the sufferer. And on the cross, this is kind of emphasized in such a concrete way that I actually love. Another thing I'm trying to avoid in this video, some more of the denominational issues. But something I do like about Orthodoxy is that they have this kind of elaborated cross. It's not just the bare, oh my goodness, it's not just the bare cross, but it contains the sign above Jesus' head, which is often abbreviated as INRI, which which is supposed to say Jesus Nazarensis Rex Judaeum, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which is thrown over his head. And I think that's actually crucial, because what the Romans are trying to do by putting that above his head is they're mocking him, because that's why they're allegedly executing him, is for this claim to a kingly title. The Pharisees are mad at him for this claim of the forgiveness of sins, but in Roman law that doesn't mean anything. And so they have to say that he's some kind of rebel or revolter claiming to be the king of the Jews. And so they're trying to mock him by giving him this kingly title, right? They're punishing, humiliating, but really what they're recognizing subversively, right? There's this idea of the subversion of this humiliation, and what they're really doing is they're revealing his kingship. They're giving him a crown of thorns. There's these mixing of the idea of kingliness, right, of the powerful, right, with charity, which is kind of paralleling, by the way, those two earlier moral instincts that humans were kind of fleshing out. This idea that you shouldn't be weak, you shouldn't be vulnerable, you should be prosperous, and that you have this dignity to yourself that you should be exercising in the world. But also this kind of equitableness, this kind of fairness, this humility, you might say, right? Because if you're not better than everybody else, if you're kind of equal, in some sense, you should be treating them that way. Now, what it's doing is it's completely fulfilling and flipping on the heads the points of those two previous moral systems, but it's still fulfilling them in a meaningful sense in the parable, in the paradigm that Jesus sets up about morality. And you might say, wow, this is really cool, but I don't believe that he's God. Like, this makes a lot of sense. You might be like the Tom Holland or something, like a Christian atheist, where you're like, I get that argument, Joe. Maybe this is a proof of the moral argument of the Jesus followers, sure. But what does this have to say about his divinity? Maybe he just made some really good points about morality that we can still ascribe to. But what proves Jesus' divinity, aside from the Lord Liar Lunatic argument, which I think is still valid and still on the table, that people don't address well, is what happens after Jesus is crucified. Jesus says all this stuff about the kingdom of heaven, right? And that the kingdom of heaven will conquer earth. And that this moral system isn't just going to be a good idea, right? Compare him to those Greek philosophers earlier who are making these moral claims, and that's that. In contrast to that, what Christianity claims is that there is an active part of God, a person of God called the Holy Spirit, who's acting on an individual level in all of us to make these social problems, these broader social issues we're talking about before with the cycles of domination and the powerful and actually exercising morality in the world, that this will be fulfilled through individual conversions and people realizing the point of the law, right? So what Jesus also does is not only does he fulfill that point of the law, so when Jesus says, I fulfill the law, well, a lot of people don't understand this and they think, well, is the law overturned? Is the law not in place? Why don't we keep kosher anymore? But what he's doing is the point of the law. Remember when I was talking before about how it's kind of fixing this sin problem in the world, right? In some way, there's all these principalities all over the world of sin, of people who are devoted to erroneous moral beliefs, if they even try to make that claim, like I was saying earlier. And it's not a good idea. Let's say that. And what a lot of them try to do, right, what Plato basically envisions is there's going to be a governmental system, if there ever is going to be a moral society, which is going to impose order and justice and morality from the top down, right? What we need to do is we need to get the philosophers into the king titles. We need philosopher kings. We need a republic of well-educated philosophers, separated enough from society to be able to think about these abstract ideas, and then they'll be able to put their morality into society through legislation. Romans kind of thought of this way very, very precisely too. The Chinese think of this way, right? So there's what's called the mandate of heaven, right? This element that if the emperor is wrong, all of these problems start showing up, right? There's this top-downness of punishment, of evil, of suffering, that is the fault of the morally in charge people. But what the Christian experience says, which is you have to realize is an unlikely argument, just doesn't make sense on the face of it, is that actually what will happen is that enough individuals will be convinced of this moral claim. It'll manifest, these moral ideas will manifest themselves in these individuals so precisely that it will totally change the world. That's his kingdom of heaven, right? When he says, when Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world, what he means is it's of heaven, and it's going to manifest itself in a way that we're not expecting. So even the Jews, who had the Old Testament expected Jesus' kingdom to be like Plato's philosopher's kingdom, or the mandate of heaven, right? Where some king conquers the world physically, subdues evil by the sword in a literal sense, and imposes moral order from the top down. But what the Bible repeats again and again, to get into the mindset of the Bible, again, even if you still don't believe, is something like God wants us, humans. He created us with the purpose of participating in this creation order. So if he did that from the top down in such an authoritative way, there'd be no point. It wouldn't be the actual moral law. And so what Jesus claims that his kingdom will come about, but not in those old traditional ways. And you might say, all right, okay, that's an interesting claim, but did it happen? What I think is so remarkable is that it just manifestly did happen. I think Tom Holland's book, Dominion, is a great example from someone who had no reason to think this, pointing out how much the Christian Revolution totally changed all morality. And you might say, well, obviously we look back now as society influenced by Christianity and think that what the Christians did was good. But what I find remarkable is how many moral systems, not Christian, are surprised by what Christianity was able to accomplish. The way I always think about it is, think about Plato's Republic, and what he wanted is he did want it to be easier. He wanted noble people, virtuous things to be happening, people to be healed. Aristotle compares a good government to a doctor. And what Christianity literally does is it invents hospitals, right? It invents this group of people who dedicate their entire... This is why I think monasticism is probably the core of Christianity, but I'll get into that in my next slide. But there's this widespread idea that some people will take care of the sick. The example I always give is if you've ever met a Hispanic friend whose last name is Iglesias. It's a very common last name. Iglesias, if anyone speaks Spanish, is close to the Greek ecclesia, which means church. And the reason that last name is so prominent is orphans in Spain who were raised by the church took on the last name Iglesias. So lots of literal orphans, instead of being exposed in the wilderness, as they probably would have been in a pre-Christian society, are now the object of our compassion and are being raised at the expense of people unrelated to them. This is a widespread practice. People do start taking care of the orphaned and the widowed and the abandoned in society. Do they do it perfectly instantly? No. But it just actually becomes something people are living out, which they weren't. And there was no realistic shot in heaven that they were going to until Christ's incarnation. And then it starts to become real in a really tangible sense and widespread. And this kingdom does grow. More and more people every year since Jesus are becoming Christian. It's never stopped. His kingdom is always expanding. The Holy Spirit, like Jesus' promise, is coming into the world and establishing its kingdom. You know, people today even think that the Christianity is receding. It's actually still growing. It's just growing so rapidly in places that it didn't used to be. And kind of shrinking slowly in the places that it's always been, like in Western Europe and in North America. And what Christianity was able to do, I'm stealing this from Paul Vanderklay, but I think he's stealing it from somebody else, is establish the idea of the two-speed religion. The reason I talk about monastics in that previous slide is that Benedict is a great example. He was living in what he considered, Saint Benedict, was living in a time of what he considered total moral decadence near the collapse of the Roman Empire. Okay, and so what he did was he said, let's kind of seclude ourselves into smaller communities and focus on the moral virtues in the West. There's obviously desert fathers and monks on the Eastern tradition which kind of go back before Benedict, but he's kind of saying, why don't we just make small outposts of the Christian society we're proclaiming into the world and kind of show them that it's possible and try to help and still have some interaction with the real world. But what we're going to focus on, as opposed to the desert fathers who, by the way, go into the desert and kind of just seclude themselves for personal moral development, Benedict is kind of saying, like, let's be a light into the world. And let's show that this stuff is possible, and let's provide public services, and let's do all this moral work. And then he does, and he attracts followers. I just don't think that... I think the funniest, the best, the greatest part of the testimony of Christianity is that I don't think people before Jesus Christ would have believed people would do this. I mean, think today. How many people do you know? I mean, unless you're literally no monks, How many people do you know who aren't Christians who do this kind of radical dedication of their life to moral principles that deny themselves entirely? Right? I mean, you'll occasionally get some like hippie commune, but it's not very hard to see how they're actually doing that because they secretly want to, like, have sex with as many people as possible or whatever, or live in common in these kind of non-sustainable ways. But instead, these are the monastic communities end up being cornerstones of discipline. And now they slowly kind of go into another direction. And by no means and what I'm saying is that all Christians are good and live up to the Christian moral standards, by the way. That's the two-speed part, right? There's the people going ham that are really living it out in an extreme and radical way. And then there's the rest of society being casually influenced by that faster version of religion, by that more radical version of religion. The other examples I have up here are St. Francis, who I think is a perfect example of people, and then the Franciscans eventually just choose poverty constantly. Another example I like to give about how Christianity changed the way we even look at kings and government and things is John the Good. He was a Byzantine emperor who was not actually very good at running the empire. By all accounts, he was not cunning enough, he was not strict enough, he was not authoritative enough to run the country well. Despite that, he's been remembered as John the Good because he just had this undeniable moral ability. Compare that to, remember that paradigm I gave earlier with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and the emperors of China. There's this idea that they should be powerful, dominating figures, and that would make them qualified for the role. Not being charitable and all these things. In fact, by the ancient pagan standards, John just failed in every regard. But by the modern Christian standards and the reset of expectations established, John will forever be remembered as the good, not because he was actually a good administrator of government or anything, but because he was charitable. And because he was kind and compassionate and soft, right? This is the new version of morality that is actually instituted by Christianity, that is not parallel in any other society. What you might realize is that the modern world has less and less of this. And up until the First World War, I think what you might have said, and what I think the Enlightenment began to believe, is, well, what we have is this moral order that always progresses. And they started to take that for granted. And they stopped attributing that to Christianity. And they just assumed this was a natural process that always occurred. And that they tried to remove Christianity from that aspect. And especially after World War I, where this old European order that was founded on Christianity, liberalism, this kind of old social order, monarchy, the things that, like the Catholic Church, the established churches, it just, after World War I, nobody believed in it anymore. There was this loss of faith in those older systems, in Christianity as a religion, and it was replaced after World War I with two familiar ideas. Now, stop me if you feel like I've explained this earlier in the presentation, but there's one group of ideologues who believe in a very dominating system of morals. They don't think about charity as good. They think about it as weakness. They think that honor, tradition, an appeal to the past, those things, an appeal to arbitrary gods, to a natural order that's cruel, right? To almost deities who reward the strong and detest the weak and the vulnerable, right? There's that aspect, which is in fascism, but also in that old traditional Catonian way of thinking. I think Cato is a little more complicated, but the Roman way of thinking, Alexander the Great, this kind of dominating morality of tradition and honor. And then on the other hand, there's this appeal to numbers and mass movements and populism, and the idea that it doesn't matter if we're being violent or whatever, but because what we're doing is we're redistributing small amounts of wealth and goods to the largest number of people possible, because it just feels more fair. And communism, and it's quite similar, and I've got to be the 90 millionth person to point out the similarities between Lenin and like the Gracchus in ancient Rome, or Julius Caesar. And I'm if I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of people who refer to Joseph Stalin as the Red Caesar, or Red Caesarism, as this concept that happens in revolutions where a lot of times there's this popular movement and then it's co-opted by a dictator. these appeals, as soon as Christianity starts to recede, as soon as the moral strength and domination over society that Christianity had, which has been slowly eroded since the French Revolution, as soon as that goes away, we're re-emerging into this older paradigm. I think without Christianity, these are the moral paradigms. And what we previously assumed was this kind of natural progression of moral values isn't natural. In fact, humans without Christianity go back to the same old, same old. The ball and chain, if you will, if that's not too crude, to their own peril. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that the 1950s are remembered as a time of extreme social conservatism and a return to Christianity. And in America, we were really, emphasizing our Christian heritage, and we added "In God We Trust" to the money and all that kind of stuff, because it looks like the rest of the world that abandoned Christianity became horrible monsters, just without ambiguity. Even the Soviet Union and the Nazis were not just they did some good stuff, but there was some icky stuff. They were monsters that had to be absolutely destroyed. We couldn't live in a world with them. They were so irreconcilable with morality, as we recognize it today. And you might say, Joe, is this your argument for liberal capitalism? I think the difference is that liberal capitalism, as much as it sometimes comes into conflict with Christian values, it still allows for Christianity most of the time. We're seeing a little bit of the recession of that in modernity, I think, to our own peril, but it still allows for Christian morality and liberalism in any religion or any government system or economic system informed by Christianity. We would expect, if Christianity was true, to still produce good effects and good results and a moral system. I think today, though, we're seeing Christianity recede again, and we're seeing that old paradigm come back. I think it's kind of the only option. And so you might say, well, how is this possible? How would it, this doesn't make sense. I don't think that's the world we live in, is it? But it starts to make sense. I think the best explanation for this trend is that all those prophecies that Jesus said about the Holy Spirit and His church and His kingdom coming onto earth, and that it will always expand, and all it just makes sense if that's true. And it doesn't seem like He was lying. And it seems like if somebody had the authority to predict so well the future of the entirety of humanity without failure, you can try to explain it away. But without a doubt, the most likely option is that this guy is divine. And if Jesus is divine, then you go back to the Lord, liar, lunatic conundrum, and He's divine and He claims to be God, and He's clearly shown to be correct and prophetical. It just seems like this guy was God. And if Jesus was God, aside from all the other arguments, there are some great philosophical arguments for God. There are some great, scientific arguments for God. But I think it's Tim Mackey who said this, but it's actually kind of hard to prove in an authoritative way the existence of the Christian God from all of these other sources. It's possible, but it's harder. What's so much easier to prove is the divinity of Jesus. And I think that this argument from history shows the divinity of Jesus in such a powerful way, such an undeniable way. Just look at the societies with Jesus and the societies without Him. And there's just such a stark contrast. And every time, it's not like, Jesus prepares these societies for morality and then He can leave and we don't have to be Christian anymore, and then all of our morality comes back or stays. The morality starts to go away when we abandon Christianity. I really think this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing an increasing divisiveness in the world today. We're seeing a consistent appeal to extremism. We're seeing a consistent appeal to very dangerous ideas. I think the Andrew Tate is a good example of kind of reemergence of that kind of domination attitude. That I think is pretty common today. And I think the intersectional movement is another one. It seems identical to the argument of we have more numbers, there are more of us, right? The argument, by the way, isn't that which I think originally a lot of civil rights was appealing to the Christian idea that minorities who are vulnerable should be the object of charity. What intersectionality is basically saying, and they'll tell you this, is actually most people in some way are a part of the majority of people who deserve some sense of privilege or honor over what's actually a very small minority of people who don't fit into any of these intersectional categories. And those are the people that are kind of the target of our populist rage. And just the fact that it just every single time repeats. And I think if you look at history for yourself, obviously I'm a history major, so I feel like I have a lot more experience with understanding this. And I was looking into Christianity after I already had an understanding of these historical paradigms. But I just think it's so stark and so undeniable that this happens every time. And if this does happen every time, that's a pretty strong argument, in my opinion, for the divinity of Jesus. And not only the divinity of Jesus, but of the correctness of his message, the infallibility of the Bible that he claimed was infallible, all the other things. And you can entail all the other Christian doctrine from this idea. I mean, especially, by the way, if you look at the way that the moral conversation shifts, I kind of missed this earlier, but like Gregory of Nyssa is a great example. If you doubt the idea that from the beginning, the Bible was an authoritative source of morality that actually made the world better, look no further than people like Justin Martyr or Gregory of Nyssa or John Chrysostom, who are making these very strong moral appeals about how the way the world should be based off of biblical principles, how marriage should be, how men should treat women with kindness and respect, which is John Chrysostom's point in his On Marriage. Gregory of Nyssa begins to oppose slavery, not even for practical reasons, but for moral reasons. I mean, people can compare this to the cynical restrictions on slavery in the Roman Empire at certain periods, like Mark Antony restricts slavery. But when they're having these conversations in ancient Rome, if you just read any of the conversation, what they're saying is slaves are taking the jobs from the majority of people. That's why they're bad. And it's not like some moral appeal to the dignity of the human being enslaved. It's a practical appeal to populism most of the time. But versus Gregory of Nyssa basically says, if you are enslaving somebody, you're doing something wrong to yourself, right? That you're participating in sin is in itself obviously evil and immoral. And it's just a new way of thinking and a new way of arguing that's been since the beginning and will be forever. And if you think that this happened, you'd probably be pretty interested in holding authoritative the same documents that those people who did all of this moral work also found authoritative to create this world that you can recognize started to begin to trend in a moral direction that even the lay person can recognize is a little bit more moral. One last appeal to this argument is in Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr, I think a lot of people are surprised when they read his appeals to the emperors. I think it's to Marcus Aurelius, where he's talking about, he's making the case for Christianity, but he's making the case that it's actually the fulfillment of Greek philosophy. And a lot of, I think, more skeptical Christians or evangelical Christians or low church, just me and my Bible Christians are very upset by these kinds of comparisons. But it actually makes a lot of sense. What he's effectively saying is the moral order that everyone else desired is actually possible in Christianity. Greek philosophers can pontificate for however long they want, for hundreds and hundreds of years, about what would be good, but they never actually make it possible. And so Justin Martyr tells, Marcus Aurelius, the emperors, actually there are these small Christian communities who they hold everything in common. They're charitable to widows and the orphans, and he describes them in detail to the emperor. Now, I imagine this argument, which he even makes in that early period, in the 2nd century, I believe, it's not as powerful then, I think, as it is today. But even he was making it then. Look at the moral difference between our society and yours. And that is really an appeal to prophecy, because what he's kind of saying is, he said, our God promised a better world, and look at him delivering. That's a pretty basic appeal. Right? I think this is the most solid argument for the divinity of Jesus and the authority of the Bible that I don't see as often as I wish I did. I think it's becoming a little more popular given Dominion by Tom Holland's work, but even people that discuss Dominion, they don't really point to this argument, the idea that it was prophetic, that Jesus actually was able to fulfill prophecies of the past. He was able to fulfill prophecies before him. He was the fulfillment of those Old Testament lines in Isaiah and millions of other places in the Old Testament, by the way. And he was able to predict stuff that actually did come into place, like the destruction of the temple in a more immediate sense, but then this literal coming of his heavenly kingdom and the establishment of a new moral order. All right. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really actually enjoyed this. This argument was really important to me in my faith journey, and I'm glad I got to share it with you. If you liked the video, like it. If you like the channel, subscribe. I've got lots of other great videos on apologetics. God bless.